I'm educational justice coach Lindsay Lyons, and here on the Time for Teachership podcast, we learn how to inspire educational innovation for racial and gender justice, design curricula grounded in student voice, and build capacity for shared leadership. I'm a former teacher leader turned instructional coach. I'm striving to live a life full of learning, running, baking, traveling, and parenting because we can be rockstar educators and be full human beings. If you're a principal, assistant superintendent, curriculum director, instructional coach, or teacher who enjoys nerding out about co-created curriculum with students, I made this show for you. Here we go. Welcome back to another episode of the Time for Teachership podcast. This is episode 208, and today we are talking about an amazing experience that I got to have in community with a preschool in New York City and my fellow coach and colleague, Kara Pranikoff. So we are going to dive into what it means to build community-wide capacity to engage in hard conversations with preschool kiddos. Now, this is preschool, and normally I'm talking about K-12, maybe even specifically high school, sometimes college applications of this. And so, as always, I do think this conversation is relevant for all grades, and high school teachers can certainly pull from even some of the specific scripts that I will share that we kind of Kara and I co-created for the purposes of these workshops we did. And I think the underpinning skill of all the things we'll talk about today are totally transferable. So don't tune out because you don't teach preschool. Okay, here we go. So in the past month, I have been incredibly excited to learn more about the needs and skills of both families and educators in the preschool space. So being a parent of a preschooler myself, it is certainly front and center of my mind at all times. And so my colleague Kara and I have been working with two awesome preschool leaders to design and facilitate a workshop both for the preschool families, which was incredible, and their staff on how to navigate conversations. Specifically for these workshops, we discussed socioeconomic status. So all of this to kind of set up what we did and what I have learned. I also want to name going into this, right, that the structural components of socioeconomic status are really complex. And we're talking to like 3 and 4-year-olds, right? And we're engaging adults who may be uncomfortable. That definitely came out talking about this stuff. So we have big feelings. Things are complex. And it's really hard to respond on the fly to kids' questions that are about anything and everything, and they just don't stop with the whys, right? So all of this is increasingly complex, which is why I think, given that this skill set is applicable anywhere, it's nice to start with preschool because it is all of those pieces that may get a little bit more comfortable with the older kiddos, but is like, all right, yeah, how do we break it down to make sense? How do we respond when there's like 40 why questions coming at you at once? How do we feel when we have big feelings that are coming up and we're trying to monitor our internal processing of that with what we externally say to a kid, particularly a young kid, right? That's all kind of coming to a head in the conversation with young kids. So here is what happened. So the families, both current families of students as well as prospective families, or families of prospective students, I should say, were invited and attended. There were about 60 families, I think, that registered, about 50 attended. So it was incredibly amazing. And the staff were impressively thoughtful, as well as the families, on kind of vulnerably sharing and really getting into like, what does this mean? And what is my experience with this topic? And how do I feel when this type of like economic disparity comes up in a preschool setting, right? Like really fascinating. I was super appreciative and amazed by everyone's kind of introspection and just willingness to share and think out loud. So for example, just like many people were uncomfortable saying the word money, which was fascinating to me. I don't know if that ever came into my awareness. Like I think certainly I know people are uncomfortable talking about money, but just to even say the word money, I thought was really fascinating. There was a preference for language like resources and not wanting to name the thing directly, which I think, given more time, we would kind of unpack and I think speaks to the larger work of a lot of social justice and political justice conversations, that we have a lot of internal work to do to excavate some of those deep feelings so that we can work through that all and then externally interact with other people, particularly children, around these topics effectively. And so I think a couple other big learnings here. This work has affirmed for me that kids are totally ready for these conversations. Research has shown
that kids are noticing socioeconomic difference as young as 4 years old. Like they know. And similarly, we've talked about on the podcast before this similar research on race, on gender. Like kids know and recognize difference and have an understanding of their socioeconomic status, their racial identity compared to others, their gender like identity. All of these pieces are things that students are ready to talk about and they do recognize it. So they are not too young, as again, research has shown us. And it has also kind of made me step back and big picture think about what are the things that tie all of the specifics of talking about socioeconomic status with 3 and 4 year olds to other things like talking about gender identity to high schoolers, right? Or doing PD for educators versus talking to families. Like, what are the kind of core components of this? And so, Cara, in her brilliance, was like, all right, let's talk about how we stay engaged in difficult conversations because this is a skill all adults and children need, and all families need, all teachers need, right? Everything. So, for any age, we kind of came up with these 3 phases. When a kid asks a question or a topic comes up, the first stage or the first thing we want to do is appreciate the question. Saying something like, thank you for bringing that up with me. That's an interesting thing to think about. Or, wow, that's a beautiful noticing. Or, wow, that's a fascinating question. I love the way your brain works. Or, don't ever stop being curious. I love that you asked me that question. Thank you for coming to me. Right? Whatever it looks like, but we want to appreciate and validate the curiosity in the question. Then we want to get curious back. So the second step is to ask a question back. So what's making you think about that? What are you wondering? Maybe how are you feeling about that? Right? And it's totally okay for us to name our feeling. We don't want like a complete outpouring of uncontrolled emotion to a 4 year old, but we do want to validate that human emotions are very real and it's okay to have big feelings and you have them too, right? Like name your emotion, explain why you're feeling that way, open it up and take the step towards vulnerability so that students or children can have that opportunity to do that and see that as an acceptable response as well. Okay, so we've appreciated the question, we've gotten curious and asked our own question back to learn more. And then, we follow the conversation, particularly with preschool age children, right? They're not going to have probably a conversation for, hours about this. But they're going to want to return to it again and again. It'll pop up in like the dinner conversation or the commute home from school or some other point. It will come up and it might come up many, many times. So kids will provide that natural opportunity to follow up. But if not, you can also follow up. You can continue the learning by gathering more resources, like a picture book about the topic, right? Pointing out things in picture books you already have or other media you can consume. You could take action if an injustice was named and we felt sad about it or upset about it, right? Like we can do something. So figure out and helps your child or the child, right, that you're discussing this with to take action, or a classroom full of children to take action against that. We can check in again a few days later, just, how are we feeling about that conversation? The other piece is what is going on internally. So these are all very external facing, right? We appreciate the question. We ask a question back. We follow up verbally or in action form, right? But what is going on in that moment where a child asks a question and you're like, I don't know how to respond? You are going to have some self-talk. And so we've included scripts for you that we will link in the blog post version of this podcast episode that you'll be able to access so you don't have to take notes while you're driving or writing or whatever you're doing as you listen to this, if you are listening to this. And so the self-talk could look like this. And you don't have to use these all. This is very inspired by Dr. Becky Kennedy, who has a lot of scripts for parenting that I certainly use. And so she's usually like, choose one. So go ahead and choose one, right? I don't need to have the answers. I just need to listen. That's a good one, right? You're absolved of having answers. I think this resonates as a parent. It also resonates deeply as an educator. There are so many times where kids ask questions. I'm like, I'm supposed to be the teacher. I'm supposed to have the answer. I don't have the answer. Yeah, right? And a lot of newer teachers will say to me, or teachers of new curricula will say, well, what am I supposed to do if a kid asks that? Like, what's the answer? And sometimes you just say, I don't know. That's a great question, right? Again, same script. Appreciate the question. Get curious. I'm curious too. I wonder what's going on with that. follow up later with the answer or support the child to find the answer. This happened recently in a PD where someone asked me, we were investigating sources in the investigating history curriculum, which is in the state of Massachusetts. The third and fourth grade is being piloted. And so in the third grade curriculum, we were analyzing a source about women during the war. And we were talking about or learning about how some women during the American Revolution were like camp followers. And someone asked, like, where are the children? Like, where are the children? What are the children doing? And I was like, that's fascinating. So, like, are these women without children? Do they have children? Like, because the presumption was a very heteronormative one, right? That they were following their male relatives into the army camps. And so I was like, that's fascinating. Really good question. I don't know the answer. Okay, let's keep talking. And they did like a turn and talk activity or source analysis. And I was so curious that I just like looked up the answer in that 2 minutes that they were doing their turn and talk. And then when we came back together, I had the answer, right? Sometimes it works that way. Sometimes you got to like go plan a lesson or go find more sources beyond a Google search. I digress. Okay, back to self-talk for difficult conversations. Here's something else you could say to yourself. The most important thing is that my kid or my student comes to me with questions. The older they get, the more involved in social media they get. There are so many rabbit holes of indoctrination, of white supremacist culture, of like all the things that are harmful. We want them to come to us. We want the space to be cultivated. We want to lean into that appreciation, that first step, right? So the most important thing is not to have the answers. It's not to be able to respond perfectly. It is that they feel good about coming to me. They can do that. Another self-talk. I can feel uncomfortable and stay in the conversation, right? So just because I'm uncomfortable doesn't mean I'm going to dip out of the conversation. I can stay in it and I can deal with my discomfort, right? I can do hard things to take a line from Glennon Doyle. Here's another one. It's okay for my kid to see I have big emotions, right? Emotions are normal and they're transient, right? I can have a big emotion now. That doesn't mean I'm going to have that emotion for the rest of my life. And finally, here's another one. I can process more later by myself or with a friend, right? So I don't have to do all the processing of my emotion. I can kind of like compartmentalize for a moment, put it to the side if I'm feeling that big emotion, right? And I'm going to stay with them in that moment. Again, we're going to link to this resource, this one pager, in the blog post for this episode. If you would like to grab it now, that's going to be lindsaybethlyons.com/blog/208. I'll say that again at the end. Okay, so big takeaways. We want to have scripts, both externally interacting with students and internally the self-talk, the helping ourselves build the capacity to stay in any conversation that feels hard when you're with a kid. And also another big takeaway is just to reiterate this idea that both current families and other community members, in this case, it was prospective families. I'm also thinking about high schools, like incoming families, 8th grade families, right? When you're coming into a 9th grade, community members, like we're building community-wide capacity. We're not just talking to educators, we're talking to families, both of students who are here and students who might be here in the future. That is really cool that that was a priority for this preschool community. Preschools particularly are transient, but I'm also thinking about other places where students are only there for a year or less, right? Military communities, different places where we only have so much time. And so we want to build capacity as much as we can in that time and extend the boundaries of who we think is connected to the school and who is kind of worthy or able to access this kind of support and professional learning and engagement, right? And so when we have more communities, more community members who are prepared and equipped with us, we're going to have kind of wraparound support for students who enter that community, which I think is super cool. Okay, I'm bouncing around a little bit here, but I also mentioned that this work is deep work, right? And so some of the questions that we invited people to think about internally to kind of work through their own beliefs about things like, I can't say the word money, are things like, what is your socioeconomic background, right? Growing up, what was it? What is it today? What are the moments in our life where there has been tension around socioeconomic status? How did you feel or act in these moments? And these kinds of questions, again, are specific to socioeconomic status now, but certainly could be used as reflective prompts in any topic of conversation, right? What is your background with this? What is your experience with this? What was it when you were younger? What is it today? What are the kind of key moments in your life where this topic comes up? And how did you feel or act, right? These are transferable when it comes to introspective things. We also did a kind of statement reading where we read like 7 statements. It was like, is this true for you or not? So we can certainly do things like that. For example, like I have felt embarrassed by my socioeconomic status. In my house growing up, we did talk about money, right? I have had conversations with my child about this. I have taken action to address socioeconomic injustice. So you could see moments where you could substitute out in the frames of those statements and that activity, different topics. Okay, we've also simplified our basic needs framework that I've talked about before on this podcast to make it like easily recallable and language that was uh, accessible enough to 3 and 4-year-olds. So before I've talked about the base needs framework, that's an adaptation of Glasser's 5 human needs as base, belonging, autonomy, survival, and enjoyment. So we just like remixed that. And it is now the 4 Fs, or it can be the 4 Fs. So we think about the basic needs as food, also including water and shelter there, but food, freedom, like freedom to make choices, freedom to choose what they're doing in the moment. Food, freedom, family, also friends can be included in there, and fun. Food, freedom, family, fun. Again, this relates to, as I've introduced it before on the podcast, restorative conversations, identifying an unmet need, being able to kind of process and advocate for what students need in the moment. Also, recognizing characters in books, friends who might have an underlying missing need, and figure out how we can address it once we name it. Also, really helpful to kind of holistically think about a human being's experience, and that, yes, there is kind of a survival element of food, water, shelter that is informed by money. And a lot of us can have different types of fun when we have access to more money, but also that fun does not have to be tied to money, right? Sometimes when we have more money, we have more access to make choices about what we do, right? And have that freedom. But it's not always necessarily the case. Sometimes for the family and friends category, we are away from family more often if our family members are working a lot to make that money, right? So I think when we think about socioeconomic difference and we think about kind of high earners, high or wealthy folks, right, and low socioeconomic status or low income earners, we sometimes bring in capitalist values, right? That it's like money is everything. And it certainly does provide better access to these things. And I think that's why this needs framework is a nice entry point to the conversation, because a lot of these things either cost money or are enabled by money. So you can kind of break that down for children, particularly young children who are just forming conceptions about money. It's kind of a confusing concept, capitalism. It is not an innate thing that kids pick up. They have to learn it. And also that we can name that just because a kid has money, and this was something that I learned from these brilliant parents at this workshop, is that just that because a kid does have a lot of money does not actually mean they have all of their basic needs met, and they may not have access to family members because they are perhaps constantly working or doing these other things connected to that access to money. And so thinking holistically about needs and meeting all of them is, I think, really, really powerful. The other thing I'm going to communicate to particularly leaders, people who design professional learning experiences around talking about this hard stuff, one of the choices that Cara and I made was to have most of the time, I think we had 75 minutes with families, and just under an hour with staff, with preschool teachers, was we actually, particularly for the families, made the majority of that time just practice. And so we gave them several scenarios, said, okay, one of you is going to be the parent, one of you is going to be the child, one of you can just be an observer and like share what you notice. Go, right? So like you're going to enact like the scenario as your starting point, and you're going to have the conversation and just practice being in conversation with someone who is emulating a 3 or 4-year-old. And I think that was a really good choice because a lot of things organically came up there. You saw people grappling with different concepts, asking a lot of really good questions after they had been in the conversation. And it was this moment of, while, role play and not real, talking to a 4-year-old, it was generating a lot of things that would not have been generated, I don't think, without that immediacy of, wait, I'm in this conversation. I'm not sure how to respond. I have this question. So I think that was really cool. And then the thing we offered kind of as a final scaffold as families were engaging in these conversations were a few scripts or sentences, came up with about 4 that were something that people could say externally, right, in conversation with a child, in conversations about socioeconomic status specifically. So this is another thing that if you kind of notice or even prepare for conversations about a hard topic and you're like, these are kind of my values aligned statements or my ways of making sense of a really hard topic and kind of breaking it down simply. Maybe it's like a metaphor, maybe it's, just a value statement. I think planning for that and having that in advance or locating it, right? Other people are doing this work that are way smarter than me and probably have these things available. So kind of curate or create your own kind of script list for some of these. And if you're a leader, maybe co-create this with staff or create it and then ask people to play with it and give feedback on it. But that felt really helpful for even just us, Cara and I as facilitators, to kind of name what are the specific go-to verbal moves that we would want to make to emphasize these really key points. Basically, these are kind of the key learnings we want students to have or children to have. And it was just kind of putting it in writing. So for example, one of the scripts is this. Sometimes people say that if you have more money, it's because you're smarter or work harder. That is not true. Lots of people are smart and work hard and still may not have enough money to live comfortably, right? Like, of course, we want students and children to know this. It's just putting it into words. So if we can distill it into like 1 to 3 sentences that you can just kind of keep in your back pocket, ideally even lower than that, not so wordy, that is going to be really helpful in the moment when you could just pull on one of those, right? And again, you don't have to use multiple. It's just one thing that you're going to recall in that moment to be able to rely on when you need it. Right? Here's a shorter one. I notice we're both feeling sad right now. How do you think we could help? Right? That's a good one. When we're talking about hard things, we're going to have those emotions come up. We're validating it. We're sharing in that experience. We're both feeling this. And then we're going to move to like, what is something that we can do so that we're just like sitting in the sadness, we feel our emotions, and we remedy an injustice, right? So one more I want to share from this because I think it starts to get at the structural nature of socioeconomic status and other injustices that certainly are structural and not just individualistic. Sometimes I think when we talk to young kids, because it's such a structural thing and that feels like such a big topic to unpack, that might feel challenging. However, what we do is often a disservice to the kids, and we simplify it to the point where we leave out the structures. And so we just make it about be nice to your friend or whatever individual interpersonal thing we could act on, right? But here's one that kind of gets at the structure. There are many reasons someone may not have enough money. It's our city's job to make sure everyone has what they need. There are people trying to help the city do a better job, right? It is our city's job. Like, that is the phrase that sticks in my head. That's going to be the phrase that's going to spur me on to the rest of that idea. But that's the short phrase that I will recall when I'm thinking about structures. It's our city's job to make sure everyone has what they need to live. And then I just love that next sentence too. There are people trying to help the city do a better job, right? Like, it's our city's job. Yes, it's a structural issue, and they could be doing a better job because we are witnessing people who don't have access to housing or food or whatever the thing is that they need. And we're not just going to let that lie. We are going to identify that there are people who recognize it's wrong and they're doing something to take action, right? So again, you could pair that, the structural kind of explanation with, I notice we're both feeling sad right now. How do you think we could help, right? So then how do we take our own action? So that was all of the pieces of that socioeconomic conversation, talking to preschoolers, workshop set that we put together. And again, we talked to the staff afterwards, and we just kind of, again, partnering with families, school and families. Truly partnering means that we are transparent in like, what are we working on as staff? What are we working on with families? Let's work on the same things and give us the same foundation. So again, we have that wraparound support for children. So they're getting the same messaging, the same language, and that's going to be easier for them to build their own capacity. If you would like those staying engaged in difficult conversation scripts, the ones that are kind of age agnostic, content and topic agnostic, you can grab that at the blog post for today's podcast episode. That's located at lindsaybethlyons.com/blog/208.
If you like this episode, I bet you'll be just as jazzed as I am about my coaching program for increasing student-led discussions in your school. Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan talk about a pedagogy of student voice in their book Street Data. They say students should be talking for 75% of class time. Do students in your school talk for 75% of each class period? I would love for you to walk into any classroom in your community and see this in action. If you're smiling to yourself as you listen right now, grab 20 minutes on my calendar to brainstorm how I can help you make this big dream a reality. I'll help you build a comprehensive plan from full-day trainings and discussion protocols like Circle and Socratic Seminar to follow-up classroom visits where I can plan, witness, and debrief discussion-based lessons with your teachers. Sign up for a nerdy, no-strings-attached brainstorm call at lindsaybethlyons.com/contact. Until next time, leaders, think big, act brave, and be your best self.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at www.teachbetterpodcastnetwork.com. We'll see you on the next episode.